The wind whispered across the vast plains, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. In the fading amber of the evening sun, a figure sat outside a weathered wooden cabin, his skin etched with decades of hardship and survival. His eyes, dark and reflective, seemed to hold stories older than the mountains themselves. At 70 years old, the Apache elder had walked through wars of nature and man, through loss and solitude, and yet his spirit remained as unyielding as the red clay beneath his feet. He had never imagined that the rhythm of his quiet life could be stirred again, not until the day she arrived. The maid appeared like a breath of spring in a world that had long known winter. She was young, barely past 20, with eyes that shimmered with a quiet determination and hands that moved with care and precision. Her presence was a contrast to the harshness of the land, delicate yet resilient, soft yet carrying a weight of experience far beyond her years. She was sent to clean the cabin, a simple task by all appearances. But something about her energy made the elder sit a little taller, made his heart beat in a way it hadn't for decades. He had lived through storms and scarcity, seen friends and kin leave or fade away, but nothing had prepared him for the feeling of being unexpectedly seen again. The cabin itself held memories like layers of sediment. Its walls were scarred by fire long ago, the roof bowed under the weight of years, and the small fireplace still bore the marks of countless winters. Yet to the elder, this cabin was more than a home. It was a testament to survival, a witness to a life lived with honor, and a vessel for the quiet pride of the Apache people. Sitting on the rough-hewn porch, he remembered the days when he was a young warrior, when laughter came easy and the nights were filled with songs of the tribe, the drumbeats echoing under the silver light of the moon. Those days were gone, buried beneath the weight of years, and he had convinced himself that they would never return. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path pulled him from his reverie. She moved with purpose, carrying a small bundle of cleaning supplies, her boots kicking up tiny puffs of dust. He noticed the way she paused for a moment at the gate, as if weighing the world she was about to enter, and then she smiled, a simple, unassuming gesture that somehow carried warmth enough to light the shadowed corners of his heart. He shifted in his chair, feeling an unfamiliar flutter of curiosity and caution. It had been so long since he had felt anything close to anticipation. "You must be the new help," he said, his voice low and steady, though there was a hint of something in it that he hadn't heard in years, an edge of wonder. She nodded, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "Yes, sir. I'm here to make sure everything is in order." Her words were ordinary, but the cadence, the ease of her tone, unsettled him in a way he couldn't place. For a lifetime, he had been surrounded by people, sometimes family. Often strangers, but none had managed to reach the corners of his mind where dreams and regrets mingled. There was something about her presence that demanded attention, that seemed to insist on shaking the dust from his soul. As the days passed, he watched her move through the cabin with methodical grace. She polished the wooden surfaces until they gleamed, swept the floors with rhythmic precision, and arranged the few belongings he had with care. It was work that anyone could do, yet she did it with a devotion that spoke of respect, not just for the home, but for the life it contained. The elder found himself standing by the window more often than usual, observing her as she worked, noticing the subtle ways she laughed to herself, the way her hair caught the sunlight, and how she seemed completely unaware of the effect she had on him. The town nearby had long whispered about him, the elder who had fought alongside his people, the man whose eyes held the history of generations. He said he was wise, unyielding, and unapproachable, a man carved by the desert winds and tempered by the hardships of life. But in the quiet of his cabin, away from the gaze of others, he felt a stirring that was new and disorienting. It was not anger or fear, but a curious, almost reckless joy. He felt 20 years younger, though the mirror reflected the reality of wrinkles and age. Still, in the chambers of his heart, something had shifted, and he wasn't sure how to understand it. One evening, as the sky burned with the last light of sunset, he found her sitting on the porch steps, humming a soft tune as she cleaned. He hesitated before speaking, the words feeling strangely heavy and fragile in his throat. Your presence here. It feels different," he said finally, his voice catching on the weight of unspoken memories. She paused, looking up at him with those steady eyes, unafraid and genuine. "Different how?" she asked gently. he could not explain it. How could he tell her that in her simple acts of care, he felt the pulse of youth, the laughter of a younger self he thought he had lost forever? How could he explain that the simple sight of her bending to sweep the porch seemed to breathe life into the shadows of his past? Instead, he merely nodded and returned to his chair, letting the silence between them carry the weight of meaning. The nights brought their own kind of reflection. Sitting by the fire, the elder traced the lines on his hands, remembering the days when those same hands had held weapons and tools, when they had built fires and carried the wounded. Now, those hands trembled slightly with age, yet they longed to do anything to reach out, to connect. And though he knew the social boundaries, the careful etiquette between a man of his years and a young woman in her place, he couldn't deny the strange vitality that her presence awakened. In the distance, coyotes cried under the moon, a haunting chorus that seemed to echo the pulse of his restless heart. He realized he had not felt truly alive for decades, that the rhythm of life had dulled to a monotonous beat of survival and routine. But now, with her laughter drifting across the cabin, with the way she seemed so unaware of the effect she had on him, something fragile and thrilling had returned. The elder's thoughts wandered to memories long-buried times, when he had danced around fires, felt the wind on his face, and dreamed of futures that never came to be. And though he knew he must remain cautious, that life had taught him patience and restraint, he could not ignore the spark she had ignited. There was a story beginning here, one he had never imagined would enter his quiet, disciplined world. Yet even as he watched her move with calm confidence, there was an unease that lingered at the edges of his mind. Change was rarely gentle, especially in a life lived with the rules of survival and honor. Something about her presence suggested possibilities, both exhilarating and dangerous, and he could not predict how it might alter the steady course he had maintained for 70 years. The tension was electric, an unspoken promise of transformations yet to come. As the first stars appeared overhead, glittering like distant fires, he realized that his world had shifted in ways he could not yet name. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, now carried whispers of a story waiting to unfold. The Apache elder, whose heart had long been shielded by decades of experience, found himself caught between caution and curiosity, between the life he knew and the vitality she had awakened. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, did not know if he could navigate the feelings rising within him, or if the rhythm of his days would ever be the same. But for the first time in many years, he felt the pulse of life quicken, the thrill of connection, and a longing that refused to be ignored. And so, as the fire crackled and the night deepened, he remained on the porch, watching, waiting, and wondering, because he had never imagined that a maid, with nothing but her presence and quiet dedication, could make him feel 20 again. The next morning arrived slow and quiet. It's a kind of morning that draped itself over the plains like a soft blanket, concealing the sharp edges of the land in muted light. The elder rose early, as he always did, and moved through the cabin with careful steps, feeling the creak of the floorboards underfoot like reminders of time past. He noticed that the maid was already awake, sweeping the small kitchen with a focus that made her almost glow in the dawn. It was a strange thing, he realized, to watch someone move through his world and feel that world shift because of her presence. He remembered when he was young, traveling with his people across these plains, hunting and surviving as one with the land. Every path, every ridge, every distant tree carried a memory, a lesson, a story of courage and endurance. And now, decades later, that world felt both familiar and foreign. The quiet cabin, the wind over the grass, the coyote calls at night, everything was the same, yet everything had changed. She had entered his life like sunlight through a dusty window, softening the shadows and illuminating corners he had long neglected. The maid worked diligently, humming softly as she went. He could hear it even through the closed door of the bedroom, and it stirred something deep within him. The sound was comforting, yet it carried a tension he couldn't place. She seemed content in her task, unaware of the effect she had on him, yet her presence made him question routines he had held for decades. It was a strange combination of fear and curiosity, of longing and caution that kept him rooted to the spot, watching and listening. He began to notice small details about her, the things no one else would see or care about. The way she adjusted the folds of her skirt when she knelt to clean the floor. The way her hair caught the sunlight streaming through the windows. the quiet determination in her eyes when she carried a heavy pail of water. These small actions seemed ordinary, but to him they carried meaning. Whispers of a life untroubled by age, unburdened by loss, yet tempered by unseen challenges. He remembered his own youth, when every day was a battle and a celebration, when every face carried stories of friendship, rivalry, and fleeting romance. He had loved once, long ago, and the memory brought both warmth and sorrow. He had thought those days gone forever, buried beneath the weight of years, yet watching her now, he felt echoes of that vitality returning. It was confusing and exhilarating, and it made him realize how lonely he had truly become. The town nearby had always regarded him with respect, even fear. Stories of his deeds, of his leadership and courage, had traveled beyond the plains and lingered in the minds of townsfolk who would never meet him. They called him wise, stubborn, a relic of a bygone era, a man who had seen too much to be swayed by the trivialities of modern life. Yet here, in the quiet of his cabin, surrounded by the scent of pine and the distant sound of the river, he felt a vulnerability he had not known in years. She had become a presence he could not ignore, a force that tugged at memories and desires he thought had long passed. He remembered the first time he had felt this way in decades. It was not love exactly, nor was it simple infatuation. It was a stirring of the spirit, a call to remember what it was like to be alive in the fullest sense, to feel excitement, curiosity, and even danger. Had learned over time that life rarely offered such chances twice, yet here it was, waiting quietly in the form of a young woman sweeping his floors. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing morning he found himself more aware of her presence. She moved through the cabin with an ease that suggested both strength and gentleness, and he began to realize that her world was very different from his. She had been born and raised in the town nearby, knew its people and rhythms, and yet she had ventured into his isolated life with no hesitation. It was this courage, this confidence, that fascinated him more than her youth or beauty. One afternoon, as the sun fell low behind the hills, he ventured into the kitchen while she washed dishes. She glanced up at him, smiled politely, and returned to her work. He noticed the way her fingers lingered on the worn edge of a wooden spoon, the concentration in her brow, and he realized that her presence made him want to engage with the world in ways he had long abandoned. He wanted to ask her questions about her life, her thoughts, her dreams, but something held him back, a sense of propriety, of caution, of the line that could not be crossed lightly. The wind picked up outside, carrying dust and the faint scent of rain. He watched the clouds gather over the distant mountains and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The world was changing, he knew, not just in the weather, but in the currents of life flowing through his cabin. He could feel it in the air, in the subtle shifts in her manner, in the way the days seemed both longer and shorter when she was near. He was caught between wanting to hold on to his solitude and the unexpected thrill of someone drawing him out of it. That evening, he sat by the fire, the crackle of flames echoing through the cabin. He held a cup of tea in his hands and let the warmth seep into his bones. He thought about his tribe, about the elders he had once listened to with rapt attention, about the lessons of patience, honor, and endurance they had taught him. And yet, he wondered, had they prepared him for this intrusion of vitality into a life built on routine and careful solitude? He could hear her moving about in the other room, organizing shelves and humming again. It was a sound that carried comfort, but also a quiet tension, as if it reminded him of something he had tried to forget. He thought about the stories of young people crossing into older lives, of lives intersecting in ways that neither party expected, and he felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him. How would he navigate the stirrings of a heart that had long been disciplined and restrained? How could he allow himself to be open without risking everything he had built? In the distance, the howl of a coyote broke the silence, and he realized he had not felt this alive in decades. There was an energy in the night, a promise of change, and though he could not see it clearly, he could sense it. Something was approaching, something that would alter the rhythm of his days, the patterns of his thoughts, and perhaps the very course of his life. He did not know what form it would take, but he felt it in every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind, every shadow cast by the flickering fire. The maid paused in her work and looked toward him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, The world seemed suspended, the air thick with unspoken words, the kind of silence that carries more meaning than any conversation. He wanted to speak, to ask her about her life, to understand the courage and care that brought her into his home, but he found himself hesitating. There was a line he had learned not to cross, a boundary drawn by experience and by the rules of life he had followed for 70 years. Yet the pull of curiosity and connection was too strong to ignore. As night fell and the stars began to pierce the darkening sky, he realized that his life had been irrevocably altered. The presence of this young woman had stirred not just memories but questions, desires, and possibilities he had long abandoned. And though he did not yet understand the path forward, he knew one thing: his world would never be the same again. The Apache elder, who had walked the plains with quiet dignity for decades, now faced a force he could neither control nor predict. And so, as the wind whispered through the trees and the fire crackled low, he sat in silence, watching, waiting, and wondering. The story of his solitude and survival had been long and steady, but now, with her presence, a new chapter had begun. One that promised excitement, uncertainty, and a revival of a spirit he thought had long since faded. He did not know what would come next, only that the rhythm of his life had shifted. The tension between caution and curiosity, between solitude and connection, was unrelenting, and he understood that the journey ahead would test him in ways both familiar and unexpected. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, with the stars above and the fire before him, he realized that the true challenge was not what the world could take from him, but what it could awaken within him. The following days carried a restless tension, as if the wind itself had shifted to watch over the cabin and its unlikely inhabitants. The Apache elder felt it in the way his body moved through the day, in the slight quickening of his pulse when he passed the maid in the hall, in the subtle ache in his chest that he could neither name nor dismiss. She continued her work with quiet diligence, unaware of the stir she had caused, yet somehow the house itself seemed to respond to her presence. Even the old fireplace, long ignored and cold, seemed to draw warmth from her footsteps, as if recognizing that life was stirring again within these walls. He tried to keep to his routines, rising before dawn to walk the land, tending to the small patch of garden that had once provided food for him and his tribe. The earth was dry, stubborn, yet he felt a certain satisfaction in working it with his hands, reminding himself that strength and perseverance had carried him this far. But each time he returned to the cabin, he found his thoughts occupied with her. The sound of her humming, the rhythm of her sweeping, the faint scent of soap and lavender she left in the air, all of it clung to him, distracting him from the order he had always prized. The maid, for her part, seemed to sense something unspoken in the air. She carried herself with calm confidence, yet occasionally her eyes would linger on him a moment longer than necessary, and she would pause, brush her hair back, and look away quickly. There was a subtle tension, a question unasked in the space between them, and the elder could feel it keenly. He had faced warriors, harsh winters, and loneliness that gnawed at the soul, yet this unspoken connection unsettled him more than any danger he had ever known. The townspeople began to notice the unusual arrangement. Rumors whispered through the market and the saloons, an old Apache living alone in a cabin, now hosting a young maid. Some viewed it with curiosity, others with disapproval. The elder had always been careful to keep to himself, and he had learned to ignore the prying eyes of outsiders. But he could not ignore the way the whispers hinted at misunderstanding, at judgment, at consequences that he had not faced in decades. The thought unsettled him, adding another layer of tension to the quiet life he had tried to preserve. There was also the question of the maid's past, something the elder could sense but could not name. She had stories she did not tell, a resilience in her eyes that hinted at challenges beyond the surface of her young life. She had a guardedness that flickered in small moments, when she received a letter that she quickly tucked away, or when her expression hardened at the sound of a distant rider on the dirt road. The elder recognized the signs. He had seen lives tested by hardship before, and he understood the weight of secrets carried silently. The thought of prying was tempting, yet he restrained himself, knowing that trust had to be earned, not demanded. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in hues of red and gold, the elder decided to walk beyond the garden, into the hills where he had once hunted with his people. The wind carried the scent of juniper and distant rain, and he felt both the thrill of old memories and the unease of the present. He did not expect her to follow, yet when he glanced back, he saw her trailing at a careful distance, moving quietly, not intruding but not retreating either. It was a gesture that unsettled him. She had crossed a boundary he had assumed would remain untouched, and he was unsure how to respond. "Why do you follow?" he asked finally, his voice low, steady, but carrying the tension of unspoken questions. She stopped, her eyes meeting his without fear. I wanted to see the land," she said simply. There was truth in her voice, yet it was layered with hesitation. The elder studied her carefully, noting the subtle flicker of anxiety in her hands, the way her shoulders tensed before relaxing. She was learning, testing boundaries, and in her own way, she was asserting herself in the life he had carefully structured. The path wound upward, the terrain uneven and rugged, reminding him of the days when he had hunted elk and deer, tracking with a patience and skill that came only from years of practice. Now, walking alongside her, he felt the contrast sharply, the strength of age, the agility of youth, and the tension of two worlds colliding quietly. He wondered what she understood of the land, of its stories, of its dangers. She had been raised near town, he realized, sheltered from the hardships that had shaped him. Yet she carried a resilience born of her own trials, something that made her presence both intriguing and challenging. At the top of the ridge they paused. Below them, the plains stretched endless, golden under the dying light. The wind picked up, and the elder felt the weight of solitude pressing against the intrusion of life beside him. He knew that the days ahead would be difficult, not because of threats from outside, but because of the complexity she had introduced into his world. There was curiosity, yes, but also tension, unspoken desires, and the fragile dance of trust that neither fully understood. Meanwhile, in town, the story of the cabin began to take on a life of its own. People whispered about the elder and the maid, speculating about their relationship, about the reasons she had come, about what might happen in a household so unlikely. Some offered warnings to one another, some took it as a sign of change, a bridge between the past and the present. The elder could feel the ripple of these stories, knowing that attention could bring danger of a subtle kind, the kind that comes from misjudgment, from assumptions, from those who do not understand the world he had built for himself. Back at the cabin, nights were restless. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced along the walls, and the elder sat awake, feeling the weight of anticipation. He listened to the sound of her movements, her soft breathing, the faint shuffle as she adjusted the blankets or prepared the kitchen for the morning. He felt a strange tension between wanting to speak, to draw her closer into his world, and fearing the consequences of breaking the careful boundaries he had maintained for decades. He had lived long enough to know that even the smallest misstep could unravel more than just a day's routine. It could shake the foundation of a life. The maid, too, lay awake sometimes, feeling the silent weight of his presence. She was aware of the stories he carried in his eyes, the history that clung to him like the dust on the cabin floor. She had learned to respect the space he guarded, yet she also felt the pull of curiosity, the desire to understand the life he had lived, to see the man behind the legend. There was tension in every glance, in every word left unspoken, in the way her hand lingered on the table before she moved away. She had arrived to clean, to serve, but now she found herself entangled in a quiet, complex dance that neither had rehearsed. Rumors, small incidents, and moments of tension began to intertwine with the daily rhythm. A neighbor's horse wandered too close to the garden. A sudden storm threatened to wash out part of the ridge trail, and letters arrived for her that she quickly hid. Each event carried a subtle threat, a test of patience and understanding, and the elder felt the strain of navigating these new challenges. It was no longer only about survival, but about the balance between the past and the present, between solitude and companionship, between caution and the stirrings of the heart. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire sputtered, she brought him a cup of tea. Their hands brushed lightly, and the contact lingered longer than necessary. He felt the tension coil in his chest, the awareness of desire, of connection, of danger, and yet there was no immediate resolution. It was a quiet battle of wills, a test of patience, a question of how to navigate feelings that had no easy answers. They sat in silence, each aware of the unspoken currents, each sensing that life had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. The night deepened, and the wind carried the faint cries of distant coyotes. the sounds of a world that moved on its own rhythm, indifferent to human desire. And in the quiet of that cabin, under the stars and the flickering firelight, the Apache elder and the young maid faced the uncharted territory of connection, trust, and change. The tension was palpable, the future uncertain, and the story was only beginning to unfold. Neither knew what the days ahead would bring. The land held its secrets, the town whispered its judgments, and their own hearts carried questions that could not yet be answered. And so, with the night pressing close and the fire casting long shadows, they sat in silence, aware that something had begun, aware that life had shifted, and aware that the challenges of trust, desire, and history were only just beginning to rise. The days that followed were heavy, with a strange electricity, a tension that clung to the air like the scent of rain before a storm. The Apache elder felt it in the stiffness of his joints, in the subtle quickening of his pulse when she entered a room, in the way the shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch and shift as if alive. Every glance she offered, every movement she made, carried a weight he had not anticipated. The simple rhythm of his life, the quiet dawn walks, the tending of the small garden, the evenings by the fire was no longer sufficient. He sensed that something significant was approaching, though what form it would take remained unknown. The maid continued her work, unfaltering, yet with a quiet intensity that hinted at her own unease. Sometimes she paused at the window, staring out at the plains with an expression that was both thoughtful and anxious. The elder noticed how her hands shook slightly when she carried water from the well, how her eyes occasionally flickered to the ridge beyond the cabin. She seemed to carry her own burdens, one she did not share, and he felt the weight of curiosity pressing on him. He wanted to ask, to reach out, but he knew that pressing too hard could shatter the fragile balance that had formed between them. The town's whispers grew louder. Some townspeople speculated about the maid's motives, imagining reasons for her sudden presence. Others spoke of the elder with a mixture of awe and caution, warning that his past was not so easily left behind. Rumors, small and persistent, began to creep toward the cabin. Carried by riders on horseback or travelers passing along the dusty roads, he felt the tension of their scrutiny pressing in, an unseen force that threatened to disturb the sanctuary he had built over decades of careful living. One afternoon, while tending the garden, he noticed footprints leading away from the cabin. They were fresh, but he could not tell whose they were. The wind had shifted, carrying a faint sound of hooves in the distance, and his instincts, honed over decades, flared to life. The land had always been a teacher, and it was warning him now. He called for the maid, but she was nowhere to be seen. His heart clenched, a mix of fear and anticipation coursing through him. Something was moving closer, and he felt the fragile calm of his life beginning to crack. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. She carried a small package, wrapped in brown paper, and placed it on the table without a word. The elder studied it carefully, sensing that it contained more than its outward simplicity suggested. Her eyes avoided his, and for the first time, he saw a shadow of hesitation cross her face. There was a story here, one she had not yet shared, and he could feel the tension tightening between them like a drawn bowstring. The nights grew colder, the wind carrying whispers through the cracks of the cabin. Fires in the fireplace cast long, dancing shadows that seemed almost to reach for them. And the elder could not shake the feeling that the world outside was closing in. He kept watch at the windows, scanning the horizon, listening for the distant rumble of hooves or the crack of breaking branches. The sense of impending confrontation pressed upon him, a silent urgency that he could not ignore. The maid, too, seemed aware of the change. She moved with a heightened alertness, setting the cabin in order with a precision that suggested preparation rather than routine. Her humming, once casual, had grown rare, replaced by the occasional glance toward the ridge or the trees beyond the clearing. The elder realized that she was as alert to the tension as he was, and a new understanding passed between them, fragile but undeniable. The quiet connection they had formed was now tempered by an awareness that the calm of their world could not last. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the sky turned a bruised purple, the elder heard voices approaching, low harsh voices, carried by the wind, mingled with the distant clatter of hooves. He motioned for her to stay quiet, and together they moved to the shadows of the cabin. The voices grew closer, unmistakably human, and he could feel the pulse of danger threading through the air. Each breath, each movement, seemed amplified. Every sound a signal of the tension building to a breaking point. The maid's hand brushed his arm, a fleeting contact that spoke of fear, trust, and unspoken questions. He felt the warmth of her presence, a reminder of life and vitality amidst the threat, and yet the danger was undeniable. The figures emerged from the edge of the trees, a group of strangers, rough and imposing, their intent unclear but menacing. The elder's mind raced through possibilities, strategies, memories of survival and confrontation. He had faced threats before, yet none had carried the strange complexity of this moment, intertwined with his own heart and the presence of the young woman. The strangers paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the cabin. One of them shouted, a harsh voice carried over the wind, demanding entry. The elder's instincts flared, his body tensing, muscles coiled from decades of discipline. He could feel the surge of adrenaline, the old fire of youth stirring, yet it was tempered by the knowledge that this was not merely a physical threat. The stakes were higher now, layered with trust, connection, and the fragile threads of a bond that had begun to form. The maid stepped closer to him, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, the world narrowed to their shared presence. There was fear, yes, but also determination, a quiet courage that mirrored his own. He realized that she was no longer simply a maid or a visitor. She was a participant in the story unfolding, her choices and actions now intertwined with his own. The tension between them had reached a crescendo, and yet the resolution remained just beyond reach, suspended in the charged air of anticipation. The strangers moved closer, their voices rising, and the elder felt the pulse of danger intensify. Every shadow, every creaking branch, every rustle in the grass seemed amplified, a symphony of suspense and uncertainty. He weighed his options, considering the terrain, the cover of trees, the potential strategies for defense or evasion. Yet even as he calculated, he could not ignore the deeper tension, the vulnerability of inviting life into solitude, of allowing connection where once only isolation had existed. The maid, sensing his readiness, adjusted her stance, a subtle signal that she was prepared to act. The moment stretched, thick with suspense, as if time itself had slowed. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke, the distant rumble of hooves, and the rising tension of two worlds about to collide. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing upon him, the uncertainty of what would follow, and the awareness that the calm they had known was forever gone. Night fell fully, and shadows engulfed the clearing. The figures at the edge of the trees were now silhouettes, their movements deliberate and probing. The elder's senses were heightened, every sound a potential threat, every motion a clue to intent. He could feel the tension coiling in his chest, the same tension he had felt decades ago on the plains, when survival depended on reading the smallest detail, when every breath could mean the difference between life and death. The maid's hand remained near his, her presence a tether to reality, to life, and to the strange vitality she had brought into his world. He realized that the coming confrontation was not just about the strangers at the edge of the clearing, but about the fragile balance between fear and courage, solitude and connection, past and present. Each decision would shape not only the immediate outcome, but the course of their shared story. The story that had begun so quietly within the walls of a humble cabin. As the figures stepped forward, a branch snapped underfoot, and the sound seemed to echo endlessly through the night. The elder felt his heart leap, muscles tensing, and the maid instinctively drew closer. The air was thick with suspense, every second drawn out like a taut wire ready to snap. The world held its breath, waiting as to lives, 2 generations. 2 stories of resilience and longing faced the uncertainty of the moment. In the silence between the approaching strangers and the cabin, the Apache elder realized that the tension he had carried for weeks had reached its peak. The mysteries of her past, the threats of the outside world, the whispers of the town, and the unspoken currents of desire and trust had converged into a single point of anticipation. The climax of their story, the moment where choices would matter most, was only moments away, yet the resolution remained beyond the horizon, suspended in a web of suspense, fear, and hope. He glanced at her, and for a fleeting instant their eyes met, sharing understanding, fear, and determination. The night seemed to pause, the wind holding still, the stars flickering in quiet witness. The Apache elder and the young maid stood on the edge of a turning point, the tension so thick it was almost tangible, and the story poised itself for the moments that would decide everything. And then, the night waited, holding its breath, leaving them man the world beyond the cabins, suspended in anticipation of what was to come. The night stretched on, tense and expectant, the wind pressing against the cabin, as if urging the world to move faster. The Apache elder and the maid stood together in the shadows, hearts racing, breaths measured, waiting for the unknown to arrive. The figures at the edge of the clearing had paused, their intentions still shrouded in darkness, and in that suspended moment, the elder felt a strange calm settle over him. The anticipation that had gripped him for weeks, the tension between solitude and connection, fear and desire, now sharpened into clarity, understood that what they had faced was not only a test of survival, but a test of trust and courage. The strangers finally stepped forward, their features becoming visible in the flickering firelight. They were rough men, travelers from the town seeking confrontation, perhaps misunderstanding, perhaps fueled by rumor. The elder assessed them quickly, noting the uncertainty in their movements and the hesitation in their eyes. He realized that strength alone would not be enough. Patience, strategy, and understanding were necessary to navigate this moment. Beside him, the maid's hand brushed against his arm again, a quiet signal that she would stand with him, and in that simple contact, he felt a surge of resolve. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This is our land, our home. Leave, and no harm will come to you." There was a weight in his tone, a history behind every word, a lifetime of experience that carried more power than any weapon. Strangers faltered, clearly unprepared for the quiet authority of a man who had faced danger far greater than their own threats. The maid moved to his side, her presence steady and reassuring. "You mean no trouble," she said softly, yet with a confidence that matched his own. Her words carried a truth the strangers could not deny, a reflection of the life she had chosen to step into, a life that demanded courage and integrity. The air seemed to shift around them, tension meeting calm, suspicion meeting honesty, and the precarious balance began to tilt. For a moment, silence stretched across the clearing. The wind carried the distant cries of coyotes, the rustle of trees, the faint murmur of the town beyond the hills. And then, slowly, the strangers stepped back, uncertainty etched in their faces, leaving the cabin and its guardians in the quiet of the night. The immediate danger had passed, yet the elder knew that the true victory was deeper, the victory of trust, of connection, of standing firm in the face of fear. In the aftermath, the cabin felt alive in a way it had not for decades. The elder and the maid moved within its walls with a sense of shared purpose, the rhythm of life resuming yet altered by the events of the night. They tended to the garden, repaired the small damages caused by the storm, and prepared the cabin for the days ahead. Every action, however mundane, now carried significance, a reflection of the bond that had formed between them, a testament to courage, resilience, and newfound companionship. The town, too, began to see change. Rumors of the confrontation spread, painting the elder and the maid in a new light not as isolated figures, but as people of strength and integrity. Respect replaced curiosity, understanding replaced suspicion, and the whispers that once carried judgment now carried admiration. The elder realized that his life, once contained within the narrow borders of solitude, had expanded, connected in subtle ways to the community beyond. Days passed, each one bringing quiet reflection. The elder found himself recalling his youth not with longing or regret, but with appreciation for the lessons learned, the challenges faced, and the resilience gained. He watched the maid move through the cabin, tending, cleaning, caring, and realized that her presence had not only awakened his vitality, but had reminded him of the enduring importance of connection, trust, and empathy. She had entered his world to serve in a practical sense, yet had transformed it in ways he could never have predicted. The maid, for her part, found her own growth mirrored in the elder. She learned from his patience, from his stories, from the careful way he moved through life. She understood the depth of experience that shaped him, the quiet strength born of survival, and the wisdom that could only come from a life fully lived. In return, she shared her own stories, her own dreams, and in those exchanges, both found a richer understanding of life, one that transcended age, background, and circumstance. Together, they rebuilt not just the cabin, but a shared rhythm. A partnership that balanced care with independence, observation with engagement, reflection with action. The land around them, once a backdrop to solitude, now felt like a participant in their story, responding to their presence, reflecting their resilience, and echoing their newfound harmony. The wind over the plains seemed less harsh, the fire in the hearth warmer, the night skies brighter, as if the world itself recognized the transformation that had taken place within those walls. There were moments of quiet joy, small triumphs, and shared laughter that reminded them both of the beauty of life lived fully, even in the simplest of tasks. They prepared meals together, repaired fences along the ridge, and walked the land at dawn, learning again to move with the rhythm of nature. The elder's heart, once weighed by decades of solitude and restraint, found a steadiness, a contentment, and a vitality that came not from youth alone, but from the profound human connection he had rediscovered. The story of the strangers became part of their shared history, a reminder that fear and tension are inevitable, yet can be met with courage, patience, and honesty. It was a lesson for both the elder and the maid, a testament to the power of presence, observation, and careful action. The community around them recognized their strength not only in survival but in integrity, and respect grew naturally where misunderstanding once lingered. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the fire crackled low, they sat together on the porch. The elder looked out over the plains, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here from the long years of solitude to the unexpected arrival of a young woman who had reignited the spirit of life within him. He realized that the world was larger than he had thought, full of connections waiting to be discovered, stories waiting to be told, and moments of courage and tenderness that could transform even the oldest hearts. The maid leaned against him slightly, her presence a quiet affirmation of the bond they had formed. She too reflected on the journey, understanding that her work had become more than a duty. It had become part of a story, a shared life, and a connection that would endure beyond the immediate moments of challenge. She had entered a world shaped by history, strength, and solitude, and had left it brighter, fuller, and more alive. As the stars appeared overhead, scattered like distant fires, the elder realized that the journey was not about reclaiming youth or undoing the past. It was about presence, awareness, and the courage to open one's heart despite the risks. He understood that life would continue to carry challenges, that the land and the world beyond the cabin held uncertainties, but he no longer feared them. The strength he had cultivated over decades now coexisted with the vitality she had awakened, creating a harmony that would guide them both into the days ahead. The cabin, once a silent witness to decades of quiet living, now carried stories of resilience, courage, and human connection. Every corner, every creaking floorboard, every flicker of firelight bore witness to their shared journey, to the lessons learned, and to the enduring power of companionship. The plains outside, wide and open, reflected the freedom and possibilities that came when hearts and minds meet in understanding and trust. In the mornings, they rose together, walking the ridges, tending the land, and preparing for whatever might come. The wind still carried whispers of the past, but it also carried hope and promise. They had faced tension, danger, and uncertainty, and emerged not only intact, but transformed. The elder felt a vigor in his step, a clarity in his mind, and a warmth in his heart that could not be measured in years alone. And so, life continued on the plains. The Apache elder, once bound by solitude and routine, had discovered again the rhythms of life, of human connection, and of trust. The maid, whose presence had begun as simple duty, had become an integral part of that story, a partner in navigating the challenges of the world and the surprises of the heart. Together, they learned that age and youth, experience and curiosity, strength and care could coexist, creating a life richer than either could have imagined alone. In the quiet evenings, when the fire burned low and the plains stretched endlessly beyond the cabin, they sat in shared reflection. The elder felt a peace that came not from escape, but from understanding. The maid felt a fulfillment that came not from accomplishment alone, but from belonging. The world outside continued on, carrying whispers of their story, echoing the lessons learned, and bearing witness to the enduring truth that connection, courage, and presence are the forces that shape lives and awaken hearts, no matter the years one has walked the earth. And in that moment, under the stars and with the wind soft against the cabin walls, they knew that life, in all its complexity and unpredictability, sky had given them something rare, a chance to feel alive again, to trust, to care, and to find in each other a reflection of the vitality that makes every day worth facing. The story had reached its resolution, not in grand gestures, but in quiet understanding, courage, and the enduring bond that had grown from curiosity, respect, and shared experience. The Apache elder never imagined that a maid would make him feel 20 again, yet here in the stillness of the plains, he understood that life always finds a way to surprise, to awaken, and to heal in the oldest hearts.